Okay, we're talking about the endocrine system, and this material is material that you'll need to know for your final test. Okay, so hormones, which of course are the chemical messengers that stimulate some or bind to some sort of receptor on a cell to cause some sort of change in the body, but they do it primarily through going through the blood. So what we're going to look at in this chart here, which is kind of an introductory chart to the chemical nature and structure of the different types of hormones. So notice in this column we have hormones that are derived from amino acids. So this area right through here would be hormones derived from amino acids. Our next column, which would be our largest group of hormones, are hormones that are peptide hormones. In other words, they're made up of chains of amino acids, and they would include this group called glycoproteins and this group called short polypeptides and small proteins. And then finally, our last big category of what hormones are, how they are chemically structured, what are they derived from, or what is their chemical nature, would be our lipid derivatives. So notice again, then that would include our steroid hormones and our eicosanoids. So again, our three major categories of hormones would be hormones derived from amino acids, hormones that are basically made up of chains of amino acids called peptide hormones, and finally hormones that are made up of lipids. And here we already see a cholesterol backbone as being one of the building blocks for lipid derivative hormones. Okay, well, let's look first then at our amino acid derivatives, and we see that a hormone that is an amino acid that actually has several hormone derivatives is the amino acid tyrosine. So our catecholamines, which you will hear that term a lot if you continue in anatomy and physiology, the catecholamines are things such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Of course, we know that's what makes up adrenaline, and these would be secreted by the adrenal medulla. And then a very similar in structure, because again they're all derived from tyrosine. So if you notice, this chemical structure looks very similar to that chemical structure, which looks very similar to that chemical structure. Dopamine is another catecholamine, but it's secreted by the hypothalamus. Okay, next, let's look at our thyroid hormones, which are also derived from tyrosine. And again, you will notice there is a common ring structure and, carbon chain attached to it. Very similar because we're taking tyrosine and we are chemically altering it a little bit to make these different structures. Well, T4, and I wish they had drawn a picture of T3 because those were those triiodothyronine and thyroxine. And T4, we can actually see the reason why it's called T4. We can see 1, 2, 3, 4 iodines in the chemical structure. And T3 would actually have 3 iodines, but I bet you guessed that already. Okay, our last amino acid that we derive a hormone from is tryptophan, and our hormone is melatonin. Now, I bet a lot of you have heard somebody say in the past that turkey makes you sleepy. Well, the reason why turkey makes you sleepy is because turkey has a lot of tryptophan in it that makes up the proteins found in turkey meat, and that tryptophan then can be used to make melatonin, which of course is secreted by the pineal gland or pineal gland, and melatonin we know helps us become sleepy. Okay, our largest group of hormones comes from the peptide hormones, which instead of just being a single amino acid would be, an actual peptide, a chain of amino acids. We divide these into two groups, the short polypeptides and small proteins. In other words, these would be under 200 amino acids. And then we divide them into the glycoproteins. So we know these would have the glucose chains hanging off of them. Well, here we can see from the glycoproteins, our pituitary gland secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Our kidneys secrete erythropoietin, that really important hormone that causes us to make more red blood cells. And then our reproductive organs secrete inhibin, kind of a negative feedback loop hormone. Now, our short polypeptides and small proteins under 200 amino acids, our hypothalamus Remember, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin and our regulatory hormones are all made in the hypothalamus. The regulatory hormones are secreted to the anterior pituitary to trigger the anterior pituitary hormones to be made, but antidiuretic and oxytocin are actually released from the posterior pituitary, even though they are made in the hypothalamus. But these are either short polypeptides or small proteins. Okay, our pituitary gland, notice a lot of those anterior pituitary gland proteins, adrenocorticotropic hormone, growth hormone, melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and prolactin fall in this category. Insulin and glucagon from our pancreas fall in this category. Parathyroid hormone that does the opposite of calcitonin. And so parathyroid hormone obviously being from the parathyroid, calcitonin being from the C cells of the thyroid gland. Okay, then the two hormones from our heart and hormones from our adipose tissue, and even the lymphatic, the hormones that are from our lymphatic system, those chemical products that are literally causing some of the changes, like the interleukins, and then the digestive tract hormones, which we'll be talking about separately. Now, finally, our last category are lipid derivatives, which are the steroid hormones, which, as it says here, are related to cholesterol. We see our cholesterol backbone in this example of estrogen, and then we know that our androgens, which is mainly testosterone, estrogens and progestins, are all steroid hormones. Of course, we know that if you're a steroid hormone cholesterol base, you have the ability to go directly through a phospholipid membrane. But look, we also have our cortisols, our aldosterones, and again, androgens from the adrenal cortex, because remember, ladies, you get your testosterone from the adrenal cortex also, and then calcitriol from the kidney, which actually helps us conserve calcium. Now, our eicosanoids, lipid derivatives from arachidonic acid, well, this structure here, which looks kind of like it's got legs on it, like a spider, is called arachidonic acid. And so these things will be like our leukotrienes. And of course, those are secreted from leukocytes. Prostaglandins, which are sometimes referred to as local tissue hormones, thromexins, and prostacyclins. Okay. Now, but bottom line is, my biggest concern is that you understand that because hormones are derived from different chemical structures, then they're going to have different chemical properties, and that is going to affect how they interact with cells and the receptors in the cells. Now, I wouldn't expect you to memorize all of this, but I would want you to be familiar with this chart enough to where, if I were to blank out, which of these belong to the amino acid derivatives, or even which of these would be considered catecholamines, I would expect you to, be able to fill in the large categories into any of these boxes that are, circled. So, if I had that blanked out and you saw that it included steroid hormones and eicosanoids, I would expect you to know it's lipid derivatives. Or if I had that blanked out and it says structurally related to cholesterol, and here you see a cholesterol backbone, I would expect you to know that that's a steroid hormone. So those are the type of things. Pay attention to the big categories and what would be included in those categories. Now, since hormones are most often distributed to the blood, then they're going to be released where there are a lot of capillaries, so they can go into the blood or be released from capillaries to go into the tissues. Now, they can either circulate freely, which means by themselves, which means they will not circulate very long at all because they'll probably be broken down by an enzyme, or if they need to last longer, they will bind to some of those plasma proteins, which are the protein carriers, but they'll always be in equilibrium between what is bound and what is releasing. So as soon as they're bound, they go to be released. As soon as they're released, they go to bind more. Okay, so again, when the free are inactivated, then they are replaced by the bound hormones. So they will either be inactivated when they actually bind to the receptor in the cell, and that will trigger the events in the cell, so we'll get the effects of what the hormone is supposed to do, or they may be broken down and absorbed by the kidneys or the liver because they aren't necessarily going to be there forever, and there's so many different hormones, they're going to do different things. But remember, our kidney is filtering things that's in our blood, and our liver's also filtering and breaking down things that's in our blood. or they can be broken down by the enzymes. That's, enzymes are there to put stuff together, rearrange stuff, or in this case, break things down. Now, this is extremely important that you get these two different mechanisms of how hormones work. So they will either work primarily by what's called a fixed receptor mechanism, which I will show you what that means in a second. And then here's kind of a list of the hormones that are basically used as fixed receptor mechanisms, or they will be mobile receptor. And here's kind of a list of the hormones that will be mobile receptors. So what do we mean by fixed receptor mechanism or mobile receptor mechanism? Okay, in this picture we see a cell with this phospholipid bilayer membrane and a receptor that is fixed into the membrane. So the hormone actually attaches from the outside, that just like we talked about neurotransmitters opening up doorways or causing some sort of reaction, here we see the hormone. In this case, the hormone does not go into the cell, but the hormone attaches to the receptor, and the receptor is fixed into the membrane. But when the hormone activates the receptor, then there are several activities that can go forth inside of the cell, even though the hormone itself doesn't go in the cell. So first thing we want to understand is that hormones either act as fixed receptors, or other types of hormones can act as mobile receptors. Now notice this mobile receptor is inside the cytoplasm of a cell, and it is actually moving around in the cell. Especially it's moving around because it's going to end up being what's going to carry the hormone to basically the activation area, so we can activate the DNA and actually cause transcription and translation. So again, this is a mobile receptor, not a fixed receptor. Okay, so hopefully now you kind of see what a fixed receptor is versus a mobile receptor. And again, notice our catecholamines, peptide hormones, and eicosanoids bind to receptors in the membrane. Well, that kind of makes sense overall when you understand that the chemical nature of those things are not going to allow them to easily pass through a membrane. Because remember, lipids can pass through lipids, but in this case, that hormone couldn't just pass into that membrane. It would have to bind to a receptor. But remember, receptors are very specific for specific hormones. That's why hormones can go all over the body, but they're not going to actually, necessarily cause the same effect in every cell. They're only going to affect the cells that have a receptor for them. Now, what is it that hormones are actually going to do for the body? So ultimately, what all hormones are basically going to do is they're either going to activate, they're going to cause a cascade of events that activate enzymes. In other words, turn enzymes on so certain metabolic reactions can occur in the cell, or they're going to create the opposite effect, and they're going to basically lead to the reduced enzyme activity, or basically turn off enzymes. So notice here, where they're going to activate enzymes, turn off enzymes. Here we see activation of enzymes. And then the other thing that we can do is actually open up ion channels. Either open them up from the inside where ions can leave, or open them up from the inside where ions can enter. So again, notice in this case, this hormone is actually eventually opening up. It's activating enzymes, but it's also opening up ion channels. Kind of similar to how neurotransmitters would open up ion channels. But instead of this necessarily doing it directly, it's doing it indirectly. Now notice it says fixed receptor membranes use a second messenger system where the hormone is the first messenger but never enters the cell. So again, notice this hormone right here is the first messenger, but it attaches to the receptor. It never enters the cell. But what it does, it triggers a cascade of chemical events where it activates a second messenger. Notice this acts as a second messenger. And what's significant about that is we get a lot more second messengers than the original hormone. So the first messenger is limited. The second messenger is amplified. We actually call this process amplification. So fixed protein receptors, first messenger, activates a chemical reaction of activating a lot of second messengers